Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend that begins with a single act of pride, an act so reckless that it would shake the order of gods and mortals alike and set into motion one of the most devastating chains of consequences in all of ancient history. What happened in a royal palace beneath the shadow of Mount Sipylus would not end with one life, nor even one generation. It would become the spark of a curse that would travel through fathers and sons, through betrayal, ambition, and irreversible choices. This is a story where every decision carries a price, where victory is never free, and where the past refuses to remain buried. As we journey through this tale, you will witness how a single moment of arrogance can echo across centuries, shaping destinies long after the original sin has been forgotten. And as the events unfold, you may begin to wonder, was this fate written by the gods or forged by human hands? Disclaimer: the visuals used in this video were created using artificial intelligence. There are no bloody or disturbing scenes. However, some moments have been designed to enhance the cinematic and emotional depth of the story. If you are sensitive to such imagery, please consider this before watching. Additionally, the narration in this video includes mythological themes such as betrayal, tragedy, and fate. This content is presented purely within a mythological and literary context. If you wish to join me on these mythic journeys, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling me which story you'd like to explore next. I look forward to sailing through these timeless tales together, one legend at a time. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of the waves guide you, wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of the Line of Pelops and the Dark Curse of Atreus begins now. At the foot of the steep, smoke-shrouded peaks of Mount Sipylus, whose jagged summits stretched toward the heavens, a magnificent palace adorned with golden marble rose in silent splendor. The master of this grand structure was the proud King Tantalus, known as the most fortunate of mortals and the earthly companion of the gods. Carrying divine blood in his veins through his lineage as the son of Zeus and the water nymph Pluto, Tantalus had placed himself far above ordinary men, surrounded by the boundless wealth of his kingdom. He had not only held authority over the kings of the earth, but had also stood among the rare mortals granted the honor of sitting at the sacred table of the gods, atop Mount Olympus. This privileged position had slowly erased the humility from his heart and replaced it with the seeds of a growing darkness, while the winds of Sipylus had whispered his endless ambitions across the world. Each feast he attended in the silver halls of Olympus did not awaken admiration within Tantalus, but instead stirred a deep resentment and dangerous envy in his mind. As he tasted the sacred nectar and ambrosia, the very source of the gods' immortality, he began to see it as a profound injustice that such divine sustenance belonged only to the dwellers of the heavens. Harboring a quiet anger toward his own mortal nature, the king ultimately chose to betray the divine trust placed in him in the darkest possible way. He secretly stole the sacred food from the table of the gods. When he returned to his palace on Sipylus, he shared the stolen divine nourishment with his mortal companions, attempting to offer them the secret of immortality. This act was not merely theft. It stood as a direct violation of the cosmic order and the sacred law that protected divine secrets, forever marking his name in the chronicles of transgression. Yet even this great betrayal did not satisfy Tantalus's pride. The dangerous curiosity that had taken root in his mind grew into a burning desire to test the absolute awareness of his father Zeus and the other gods. On the day he prepared to welcome them into his palace, he resolved to present them with the most horrifying trial imaginable, one that defied the natural order itself. He turned his own son, Pelops, the innocent symbol of his lineage and future, into a dark experiment meant to prove whether the divine could be deceived. With a coldness stripped of all paternal compassion, he violated the most sacred laws of nature and caused the loss of his child's life in pursuit of his unholy test. In his darkened mind, Pelops ceased to exist as a son and became nothing more than an instrument to measure the limits of divine perception. With that act, an unshakable shadow fell over the lands of Sipylus. When the hour of the great feast arrived, the residents of Olympus took their honored places among the marble columns of Mount Sipylus. Wearing a mask of false grace and deep respect, Tantalus presented his forbidden offering with unmistakable pride. The joyful melodies and conversations that filled the hall suddenly fell silent, replaced by a suffocating stillness that resembled the quiet of a tomb. The all-seeing eyes of the gods immediately recognized the horrifying truth hidden within the offered bowls. What lay before them was not the flesh of an ordinary animal, but a sacred piece torn from Tantalus's own blood and flesh. Confronted with this act of unspeakable corruption, which shook the balance of the cosmos itself, the gods recoiled in horror and refused to take part in such a violation. Yet among them sat Demeter, the goddess of fertility, whose heart beat beneath the heavy shadow of grief. Consumed by the agony of her daughter Persephone's abduction into the underworld, her mind remained clouded with sorrow. While the other gods froze in outrage, Demeter, lost in her grief and distraction, took a small piece from the tragic offering placed before her. This moment became one of the most sorrowful reminders that grief did not blind only mortals, but gods as well. Without realizing it, Demeter shared in the suffering of innocence. But when Zeus's fury echoed across the peaks of Sipylus like thunder, the price of Tantalus's arrogance was sealed, not merely in death, but in eternal condemnation. Zeus delivered one of the most severe and symbolic punishments ever imposed, casting Tantalus into the depths of Tartarus, the darkest abyss of the underworld. His punishment reflected the very essence of his ambition, an endless cycle of desire and deprivation. He stood within a pool of clear, cool water, yet whenever he bent down to ease his burning thirst, the water retreated beyond his reach, leaving only dry earth beneath his feet. This eternal thirst became the price of his attempt to steal immortality from the gods, while the cold walls of Tartarus swallowed his cries of despair. Hunger, too, remained an inseparable part of his torment. Above his head hung a magnificent tree, its branches heavy with the ripest, most beautiful, and most radiant fruit. Yet whenever Tantalus reached upward, driven by unbearable hunger, a violent wind rose and carried the branches beyond his grasp. Every hope of fulfillment slipped away from him at the final moment, reflecting the arrogance that had once defined his life. Trapped forever in the endless void between desire and denial, Tantalus became a prisoner of his own dark pride, buried in the depths of eternity. His fate stood as the clearest proof of the destruction that followed when mortals defied the gods. His suffering in Tartarus did not end with hunger and thirst. According to ancient accounts, a massive stone hung above his head, suspended by an unseen force, forever threatening to fall. This looming weight embodied the burden of his arrogance and filled every moment of his existence with unrelenting dread. It stole all peace from him, replacing it with the constant expectation of annihilation. The proud king who once sat beside the gods had become nothing more than a trembling shadow, dissolving into fear and deprivation. Thus, the tale that began in the glorious palace of Sipylus ended in the endless darkness of Tartarus. Tantalus's transgression did not shape only his own fate. It sealed the destiny of his entire bloodline. His crime became the first and most defining link in the terrible curse that fell upon the house of Tantalus and echoed through generations. The tragedy at Sipylus and the judgment of the gods did not mark an ending, but the beginning of an inescapable fate. Pelops's restoration to life by divine will did not close this chapter. It opened a new era. The fracture created by Tantalus's pride never faded with time. Instead, it echoed across generations, becoming an unavoidable inheritance that shaped the destiny of the Tantalid line. In the silver halls of Olympus, the shock caused by the infamous feast King Tantalus had offered had not yet faded. When the all-seeing eyes of the gods recognized the tragic truth within the bowls set before them, a deep silence settled over the heights of the sky. Such a brutal sacrifice of innocence shook the scales of divine justice, and Zeus's wrath continued to echo across the peaks of Mount Sipylus. Yet alongside that fury, a profound compassion took root in the hearts of the gods for young Pelops, whose light of life had been extinguished for the sake of his father's arrogance. As Tantalus was condemned to the darkness of Tartarus, the gods chose to mend Pelops's unfinished existence through sacred intervention, seeking to correct the injustice and restore the balance of the cosmos. Within the great and sacred cauldron formed by divine will, the purest essences of life gathered to reshape Pelops's being. Each god contributed a fragment of divine power and grace to the miraculous act of resurrection, weaving the young prince's body and soul together as if crafting a masterpiece. As the dwellers of the heavens worked in silent harmony to erase the dark destruction Tantalus had unleashed, the divine light surrounding the cauldron softened the gloom that hung over Sipylus. This process marked not only a physical return, but also a divine triumph of innocence over darkness, destined to be etched into cosmic history. As Pelops's existence stirred back to life beneath the touch of divine hands, the fractured harmony of the universe slowly began to mend. Yet at the very center of this magnificent ceremony of rebirth, a tragic absence emerged from beneath the shadow of grief. Demeter, goddess of the harvest and guardian of the earth, had withdrawn her heart and mind from the world, consumed by the agony of her daughter Persephone's abduction into the underworld. At that fateful table, crushed beneath the weight of her sorrow, she had unknowingly consumed the portion of Pelops that formed his shoulder. This was not merely a divine error, but a sorrowful testament to how a mother's grief had seeped into a sacred miracle. When the resurrection was complete and the young prince regained his form, all saw the tragic void where life's energy had not been fully restored in one of his shoulders. That absence stood as a silent sign of how even the mightiest beings could be blinded by grief, and how human suffering could ripple into the workings of the divine. Hephaestus, the master craftsman of the gods, moved at once to remedy this sorrowful imperfection and restore Pelops's body to wholeness. With Zeus's approval, a new piece was fashioned from smooth and precious ivory, gleaming like moonlight, to replace the missing shoulder. The ivory was set into Pelops's body with such skill and divine harmony that it fused seamlessly with the living flesh around it. Bearing a radiant mark upon his shoulder, Pelops became both the embodiment of a miracle rescued from darkness and the eternal reminder of his father's unforgivable crime. Whenever the cold yet noble sheen of ivory caught the light against his skin, it seemed to whisper at once of the gods' mercy and the vast destruction born of Tantalus's pride. When Pelops opened his eyes to the world once more, he immediately sensed that he stood far removed from the unblemished innocence of his former life. The white ivory that shone against his skin reminded him with every touch of his father, Tantalus's arrogance, and of the second chance the gods had granted him, a chance heavy with burden. Though his resurrection had been celebrated on Olympus as a triumph of justice, Pelops knew how deep the shadow behind that miracle truly ran. The blood in his veins carried not only the nobility of a prince, but also the first seeds of an inescapable fate that would spread through his entire lineage. His ivory shoulder became an inseparable part of his life, like an indelible seal that silently cried out the horror of that dreadful feast and the wrath of the gods whenever he saw his reflection. The enormous crime Tantalus committed had not only condemned him to the depths of Tartarus, but had also laid the foundation for a grim family curse that would endure throughout the line of the Tantalids. The gods never forgot the great betrayal of a father against his own child, or the arrogance of testing the divine, and they cast the shadow of that sin over the entire bloodline like destiny itself. Though Pelops breathed again and walked upon the earth, he bore not only the weight of ivory upon his shoulder, but also the inherited guilt passed down from his father. This cursed beginning marked the first link in an endless chain of betrayal, tragic ruin, and fraternal strife that would repeat itself in every new generation. As the young prince struggled to preserve his honor within this dark inheritance, he felt in his very bones the ancient law that would prepare the ground for his family's future disasters. When he returned to his magnificent kingdom at the foot of Mount Sipylus, he faced the bitter truth that nothing would ever be the same. The vast stone walls of the palace still seemed to echo with the silent cries of that ominous feast and the scent of spilled innocence. Though his people and the court beheld their prince restored to life, the love they once felt had given way to a deep unease and a sense of ill omen. The ivory shoulder gleamed strangely beneath even the finest silks, reviving in every mind the memory of Tantalus's blasphemous attempt to test the gods. Living in the shadow of his father's sins, Pelops felt himself becoming a stranger in his own land, drifting further from those lands with each passing day. The young prince resolved that he would no longer allow himself to be crushed beneath the weight of his father's crime and the heavy divine punishment that followed. The rich and fertile lands of Sipylus could not conceal the dark fate that had settled over them. Each wind that passed through the marble columns seemed to carry Tantalus's pride once more. Pelops understood with sorrow that the curse had taken root in that soil, and that he would never fully escape his father's shadow if he remained. Hoping to restore his name and honor, and perhaps disperse the dark cloud over his lineage in distant lands, he chose to abandon his ancestral home and all its wealth, and set out into the unknown. For him, this decision was not merely exile, but a brave and sorrowful step toward rebuilding his own destiny. Pelops's flight to Greece formally began, when the mournful ship departed from the harbors of Sipylus and set out to sea. As he left the shores of Anatolia behind, he carried not only a forsaken kingdom and treasures of gold, but also the bloody memories of one of humanity's gravest crimes. His vessel cut through the harsh waters of the Aegean Sea, drawing him closer each day to a new world, the fertile lands that would one day bear his name as the Peloponnesus. Throughout the arduous voyage, Pelops lay beneath the stars each night and questioned why the gods had granted him a second chance and what his ivory shoulder truly meant in his life. The journey hardened his character and transformed him into an ambitious man willing to pursue survival by any means, while the ancient curse within him slipped alongside him like a silent passenger toward his new homeland. When he reached the western shores and set foot upon Greek soil for the first time, his mind held only the desire for power, legitimacy, and a future free from his father's shadow. Upon arriving in Pisa, he learned of the deadly contests King Oenomaus held for the hand of his daughter Hippodamia, and this knowledge stirred within him the urge to rewrite his fate. For Pelops, who sought a place in this foreign land, the perilous race appeared as both an opportunity to claim a kingdom and a chance to erase the dark stains upon his lineage. Yet whether he realized it or not, his ivory shoulder continued to whisper wherever he went, reminding the world who he was and from what darkness he had emerged. Pelops entered his new homeland not only as a would-be hero, but also carrying a fragment of his father's arrogance within him. Standing upon the balcony of the palace in Pisa and gazing toward the horizon, Pelops tried to bury the painful memories of the past in the depths of the sea, yet the white gleam of his ivory shoulder shimmered once more beneath the evening sun. Though he had fled the cursed lands of Sipylus, he began to sense that every dream he would build and every victory he would claim in this new land would demand a price. As the cries of challenge rising from Oenomaus' palace and the approaching thunder of the great race echoed in his ears as heralds of a new struggle, the young prince understood that fate had already begun to weave its web. As this second chapter of sorrowful exile and restless searching fell into silence, it prepared to give way to new blood and betrayal, soon to be spilled upon the plains of Pisa, while the ill-fated history of the House of Pelops began to take root in these lands. King Oenomaus, who ruled the lands of Pisa, was a sovereign unlike any mortal Pelops had ever encountered before, a ruler whose name had become synonymous with fury and jealousy. Oenomaus had a daughter named Hippodamia, whose beauty had spread far and wide in whispered admiration. Yet rather than allow her to marry and leave his side, the king had imposed a deadly condition upon every suitor who dared seek her hand. As the sources described, he had forced each young man into a perilous chariot race where the victor would marry Hippodamia and the defeated would lose his life. This contest had never been an ordinary sporting event, but a bloody trap the king had devised to keep his daughter forever within his reach, for his chariot and horses had been blessed by Ares himself, the god of war, and had been granted an invincible and terrifying speed. When Pelops arrived at the entrance of the city and saw the grim and cautionary remnants of the 13 suitors who had perished before him, he felt the full gravity of the challenge deep within his bones. The walls of Oenomaus' palace seemed to stand soaked in the sorrow of those who had failed, and the restless winds whispered the silence that failure had left behind. Yet Pelops was not merely an exile searching for a kingdom. He carried the cursed blood of his father in his veins, and his spirit burned with an unrelenting will to survive. The moment he first saw Princess Hippodamia, her sorrowful beauty ignited within his heart both a powerful love and that ancient Tantalid hunger, a ruthless ambition that regarded every path as permissible if it led to victory in this deadly trial. Hippodamia, who had lived as a prisoner within the shadows of her father's merciless and blood-stained obsession, immediately noticed the divine radiance that reflected from the ivory of the stranger's shoulder. The unwavering resolve in Pelops's gaze and the nobility of his presence awakened within her a fragile but profound hope that she might finally escape the cycle of death that had imprisoned her for so long. Pelops, seized by this sudden and overwhelming passion for Hippodamia, made a decision within moments that few mortals would have ever dared to make. When he declared that he would challenge Oenomaus and his invincible horses, as well as the mighty chariot blessed by Ares, he had not merely wagered his own life, but had drawn the fate of his entire lineage into a new and uncertain destiny. When King Oenomaus saw this new suitor standing before him, he regarded him with cold contempt and calmly reminded him of the unchanging rules of the race. The terms were simple. The suitor would depart first, taking Hippodamia with him in his chariot, and after a brief delay the king would pursue him from behind. If the king caught him, he would strike him down with his spear and end his life without hesitation. Oenomaus trusted completely in his divine horses, which no mortal steed had ever outrun. Yet as Pelops measured the strength of his opponent, he sensed that the cunning and deceit he had inherited from his father Tantalus would become his true salvation in this contest. He understood that courage alone could never rival the speed of the gods. At this critical moment, Pelops realized with cold and deliberate cunning that the path to victory did not lie solely in the strength of horses, but in the betrayal of the man the king trusted most. Myrtilus, the king's master charioteer, was the son of Hermes, the messenger god. Yet he had lived as a servant under Oenomaus' command, carrying within him the weight of long-suppressed ambitions. When Pelops recognized this weakness in Myrtilus's character, he slipped into the palace stables under the cover of night and entered into a secret and shadowed bargain with him. As the sources emphasized, this agreement had rested upon a bribe so great that it could not be refused. Pelops had offered him half the kingdom, or as an even darker promise, a private reward involving Hippodamia herself. Though Myrtilus carried the cunning of his father Hermes in his blood, he could not resist the temptation of the power and earthly pleasures Pelops had placed before him. This gifted man, who had spent years living as a servant beneath the king's shadow, accepted the treacherous plan that would shatter his master's absolute authority. According to their secret agreement, he removed the vital bronze linchpins that secured the wheels of the king's chariot and replaced them with false pins made of wax. This sabotage ensured that, at the most critical moment of the race, the heat created by speed and friction would melt the wax, cause the wheels to break free, and condemn the king to death beneath the wreckage of his own chariot. That night, when Pelops clasped hands with Myrtilus, he felt deep within himself the same unsettling echo of betrayal that his father Tantalus had once inflicted upon the gods. The ivory of his shoulder shone in the darkness and dazzled Myrtilus's eyes. Yet Pelops did not fully understand that this act of treachery had planted not only the seeds of victory, but also the seeds of the terrible curse Myrtilus would utter with his dying breath. In that moment, Pelops knew only one truth. He would claim Hippodamia's love and ascend to the throne of Pisa. The king's blood that would be spilled and the bonds of loyalty that would be broken stood before him as nothing more than necessary obstacles on the path he had chosen. When the first light of dawn illuminated the plains of Pisa, the magnificent war chariots stood prepared side by side in the dusty field. King Oenomaus armed himself proudly with the spear of Ares and waited eagerly for the moment he would strike down his challenger. Pelops stood beside Hippodamia, who trembled with fear as she climbed into the chariot with him. The king never imagined that the divine glow reflecting from the young man's ivory shoulder concealed the silent betrayal that had already sealed his fate. When the race began, Pelops' chariot surged forward with tremendous speed, while the thunder of Oenomaus' pursuing horses shook the earth like a force rising from beneath the ground itself. When they reached the midpoint of the road, Oenomaus drew close to his prey with his usual arrogant confidence and raised his spear to deliver the final blow. At that very moment, the wax pins Myrtilus had installed began to melt under the relentless heat of speed and friction. The wheels tore free without warning, and the king's chariot shattered into chaos, his invincibility collapsing within a cloud of dust. As Oenomaus fell beneath the wreckage and faced his death, he saw, in his final moment, the treacherous smile of Myrtilus and the victorious gaze of Pelops. With the king's tragic end, the bloody tradition of Pisa came to its conclusion. Yet the victory Pelops had secured through deception had already opened the dark path that would soon lead to Myrtilus's own death. As Pelops and Hippodamia rode forward through the dust, leaving behind the king's lifeless body, they left not only the fall of a kingdom in their wake, but the dark beginning of a cursed lineage. With the false and divine legitimacy symbolized by his ivory shoulder, Pelops had claimed his right to rule as the new king of Pisa. Yet the promises he had made to Myrtilus weighed heavily upon his heart. The thought of sharing either his kingdom or the woman he loved with a servant stood in direct opposition to his Tantalid pride. This conflict marked the beginning of the tragic cliffside betrayal that would soon unfold and would forever be remembered as the origin of the dreadful curse of Myrtilus. Thus, as the new sun rose above the towers of Pisa, it proclaimed Pelops' victory while casting the shadow of a new betrayal across the land. Like his father Tantalus before him, Pelops chose to sacrifice his allies in his pursuit of power and ascended his throne as the victor of this bloody contest. Hippodamia concealed the horror of her father's death deep within her heart, while the celebrations of their victory stood destined to be shattered by the terrible curses Myrtilus would soon unleash. As the sun sank over the plains of Pisa, it did not mark the triumph of Pelops' line, but the beginning of the endless bloodshed, the bitter rivalries and the devastating tragedies that would one day consume Atreus and Thyestes as darkness closed over the land. As the massive cloud of dust rising over the plain of Pisa slowly settled back to the ground, the wreckage of the invincible horses of Ares and the magnificent chariot of King Oenomaus proclaimed to the world the tragic end of a tyrant. King Oenomaus had sent dozens of innocent young men to their deaths rather than share his daughter Hippodamia with anyone. Yet on that day, he became a victim of the very bloody game he had designed and of the pride he had believed to be unbreakable. His body, crushed beneath the shattered remains of his chariot, painfully proved how fragile and mortal a ruler was who once claimed to be armed with divine power. Pelops, standing before the ruin, with the eerie light reflecting from his ivory shoulder, resembled a cold and composed outsider, preparing to pay the price of his victory, quietly weighing how deeply that triumph had been rooted in betrayal. Pelops had decided to use the sharp intelligence he inherited from his father, Tantalus's infamous defiance of the gods, in the darkest and most twisted way to win the race. The secret of Oenomaus's unbeatable chariot lay in the unshakable strength of its metal frame. Yet through the skilled hands of Myrtilus, that strength had turned into a carefully plotted act of treachery. Myrtilus, the son of the messenger god Hermes, had chosen not to remain loyal to his master, but instead yielded to the worldly pleasures and hunger for power that Pelops promised, becoming an accomplice to a great sin. In absolute secrecy, he removed the vital linchpins that secured the wheels of the king's chariot and replaced them with false pins made of wax. This act did not stand as mere sabotage. It became one of the harshest blows ever struck against trust and loyalty. After the cries of victory echoed across the plains of Pisa, Myrtilus approached Pelops with great impatience and demanded the reward for their secret and shadowed bargain. As emphasized in the sources, that demand rested on a heavy and unacceptable price: either half the kingdom or a dishonorable night with Princess Hippodamia. Drunk on the thrill of being the hidden hero who brought down a king, Myrtilus believed Pelops would remain forever grateful and fulfill his every wish without resistance. Yet since his resurrection, Pelops had carried in his heart nothing but unshakable ambition and a relentless desire for absolute power, leaving any trace of mercy behind in his grave on Mount Sipylus. The thought of a charioteer sharing in his royal legitimacy and in the woman he loved stood, in Pelops' eyes, as an unforgivable insult. Within seconds, Pelops understood that the only way to silence Myrtilus and bury the secret of the bloody sabotage forever was to commit another murder. Taking Hippodamia with him, he led Myrtilus toward the desolate cliffs of Geronea under the pretense of marking the borders of the kingdom and inspecting his new lands. Walking beside the ivory-shouldered prince with full confidence, Myrtilus failed to recognize that this man, like his father Tantalus, could sacrifice even those closest to him for the sake of his own ambition. As the harsh, cold wind from the sea roared along the edge of the cliff, the icy determination in Pelops' gaze planted for the first time a deep and genuine fear in Myrtilus's heart. When they reached the most dangerous edge where the rocks met the sea, Myrtilus waited for the promises made to him to be fulfilled, and suddenly felt Pelops' strong hand against his back. That touch did not carry the gratitude of a friend or ally. It marked the final decisive blow of an executioner. Without a moment of hesitation, Pelops caused Myrtilus to fall from the cliff, and he disappeared into the waves below. As Myrtilus fell through the empty air, the descent symbolized not only the fall of a body, but also the destruction of a god's son and a trusted confidant. Yet the great betrayal Pelops committed did not erase the secret as he had hoped. Instead, it transformed into the ominous beginning of an eternal curse that would follow his entire bloodline. Just before striking the rocks and sinking into the dark waters, Myrtilus used his final breath to raise a terrible and heart-wrenching cry toward the sky. Carrying the divine blood of Hermes in his veins, he cursed Pelops and all his descendants with the heaviest imprecations history would remember. This moment sealed what the sources defined as the first curse, the beginning of the endless chain of calamities that would spread through Pelops's line and into the House of Atreus. Though Myrtilus's voice faded among the raging waves, the dark curse he uttered lingered in the emptiness of the universe and seeped like a poisonous vine into the foundations of the kingdom Pelops dreamed of building. When Myrtilus's lifeless body disappeared into the depths of the sea, Pelops believed he had freed himself completely from all burdens and dangerous witnesses. His ivory shoulder shone brighter and nobler than ever beneath the burning light of the sun, continuing to grant him the illusion that he stood as a legitimate king approved by the gods. Yet that false brilliance never covered the heavy shadow left behind by Myrtilus's dying curse. By betraying his own ally and breaking a sacred promise, Pelops compounded the ancient sin of his father Tantalus, who once deceived the gods. This act declared clearly that the family's legacy of bloodshed no longer stood only against the gods, but had become an unavoidable fate among men. As Princess Hippodamia looked at the man who had killed her father and executed her father's most loyal charioteer, she painfully realized that an indescribable horror had seeped into the depth of her love. The kingdom Pelops gained through cunning had been built upon betrayal, sabotage, and murder. Though the people welcomed them back to the palace as saviors with joyful celebration, Myrtilus's curse had already begun to drift like an invisible mist among the tall marble columns. The curse Myrtilus spoke as he fell from the cliff did not remain merely the echo of a dying man's anger. It endured as part of a greater and inevitable order of fate. His words represented not only the final reaction of a life that ended in that moment, but the beginning of a long and dark destiny that would surround Pelops' lineage. As the ancient accounts later described, this event became one of the first and most decisive links in the chain that would be known as the Curse of the House of Atreus. From that point forward, the second life granted to Pelops by the gods no longer stood as a simple blessing, but as the bearer of a heavy destiny. The moment sealed by Myrtilus's death transformed into a memory that endured even in the shadow of Pelops' victories. From then on, every rise of that bloodline carried within it the hidden possibility of downfall, and every new beginning bore the indelible marks of the past. The waters into which Myrtilus fell eventually bore his name, serving as a silent reminder that what happened had not been forgotten. Even as Pelops sat upon his throne, the sound of the waves rising from the sea continued to whisper that the consequences of his choices remained alive. After the bloody victory he won on the dusty roads of Pisa, Pelops of the Ivory Shoulder rose to such immense power and prestige that his name came to define the entire Peloponnesian peninsula. Yet the foundations of that magnificent kingdom rose beneath the shadow of the terrible curse Myrtilus hurled as he fell from the cliff, and it continued to move through the palace walls like a restless wind. Within the palace of Pelops and Queen Hippodamia, fearless and ambitious princes such as Atreus and Thyestes grew up, their names destined to be remembered in history. Yet another name held a place in the king's heart above all the others. That name belonged to Chrysippus, born from Pelops's union with a nymph, whose grace and beauty became widely known even among his brothers. The king's deep affection for that young son quietly planted the seeds of jealousy and unrest, which began to grow within the marble corridors of the palace. Queen Hippodamia began to see her husband's intense devotion and favor toward that illegitimate son as a threat to the rightful claim of her own sons, Atreus and Thyestes to the throne. As the daughter of Oenomaus, she understood how fragile a throne gained through deception and blood could be, and she feared deeply that Myrtilus's curse would fall upon her children. Feeding that fear with growing hatred each passing day, Hippodamia finally devised a dark plan and summoned her sons to her side, whispering to them of the supposed danger Chrysippus posed. She believed Pelops intended to leave his kingdom to that favored son, which would cast her own son's future into darkness. Her quiet and manipulative words awakened a deep and irreversible hatred in the ambitious hearts of Atreus and Thyestes. Atreus, the elder son who carried his father's fearless name, quickly came to believe under his mother's influence that the death of his brother to preserve the kingdom. Thyestes, driven by his cunning and competitive nature, accepted without hesitation his role as Atreus's accomplice in that dark plan. The two brothers, as if they had completely forgotten the tragic fate of their father Pelops, who once suffered death and returned to life by divine intervention, chose to stain their own hands with innocent blood. Acting under Hippodamia's encouragement, they lured Chrysippus away from the safety of the palace walls under the pretense of an ordinary hunt, waiting for the right moment in isolation to carry out the terrible act. That moment marked a dark turning point, one that awakened Myrtilus's curse once again. When Chrysippus's lifeless body was discovered in the depths of a dark well near the palace, the divine light that once reflected from Pelops's ivory shoulder gave way to an unbearable grief and fury. When the king learned that the murderers of his beloved son were Atreus and Thyestes, born of his own blood, he painfully realized once again the devastating power of the ancient Tantalid curse that had entered his household. Pelops's soul trembled deeply as he saw in his son's crime the same cruelty and arrogance that once defined his father Tantalus, who had defied the gods themselves. That murder transformed the cursed inheritance of the family from the wrath of an external enemy into the terrible curse of a father cast upon his own children. When Pelops summoned Atreus and Thyestes before him, he delivered his judgment not only as a king, but as a wounded father whose bloodline had been stained by betrayal. He banished his sons and Queen Hippodamia, who had encouraged the crime, from his kingdom forever, casting upon them a curse that their lineage would never find peace. As recorded in the sources, Hippodamia could not bear the weight of that shame and exile and ended her own life, while Atreus and Thyestes began their difficult journey north carrying nothing but their father's curse. That exile marked the continuation of the dark tragedy that began with Tantalus and branched through Pelops, now leaving the Anatolian shores and moving toward the formidable lands of Mycenae. For the brothers, the path ahead no longer allowed any return. As the brothers traveled in exile, they became strangers driven only by ambition, completely severed from the divine favor and protection once symbolized by their father Pelops's ivory shoulder. Atreus's fearlessness slowly transformed into cruelty, while Thyestes' cunning evolved into a destructive capacity for betrayal, darkening their souls. Though they had been physically cast out of their father's kingdom, they had not yet fully understood that the true burden they carried flowed through their veins in the form of inherited guilt and unavoidable fate. Their journey eventually brought them to the massive stone gates of Mycenae, ruled by their relative and nephew, King Eurystheus. That journey became a passage that sharpened both their hidden rivalry and their hunger for power. King Eurystheus of Mycenae, the son of Pelops' daughter Chrysippus, granted them refuge out of respect for their shared blood, despite knowing the story of their exile. As the two brothers passed through the great Lion Gate of Mycenae, the city became not only their refuge but the place where their fate would take a new form. At first welcomed as guests within Eurystheus's palace, they behaved with patience and care, earning the trust of the people and the nobles of Mycenae. Yet that calm beginning soon laid the foundation for a new rivalry between the brothers, shaped by events surrounding the future of the Mycenaean throne and the golden lamb that would symbolize the will of the gods. Though the sons of Pelops had left their father's lands behind, the shadow of the fate they carried had already begun to make itself felt in Mycenae. When Atreus and Thyestes stood at the gates of Mycenae and looked back, they still felt the weight of their past upon them. Chrysippus's death had become more than a memory. It had become an inseparable part of their destiny. Eurystheus granted them the city of Medea and its surrounding lands, both to protect them and to limit their influence. Yet that new life failed to suppress the desire for power growing within them. Their exile did not mark an ending, but the beginning of a new chapter. The will of the gods continued to guide them toward a reckoning that remained unfinished. Chrysippus's death stood as the first clear sign of the division within the bloodline of Pelops. Hippodamia's fears, Atreus's resolve, and Thyestes' calculating nature combined to push the Tantalid dynasty onto a path without return. As Mycenae became the new center of that fate, the bond between the brothers weakened further. Exile did not end the curse. It allowed it to take root in new lands. The great gates of Mycenae opened not only to two exiled princes, but to the unfinished destiny of the Tantalid bloodline itself. Though Atreus and Thyestes did not yet realize it, it had already become inevitable that fate was leading them toward a far greater reckoning. The massive and imposing walls of Mycenae, built from enormous stones, fell into one of the heaviest and most unsettling silences in history after King Eurystheus died childless on the battlefield. This deep silence did not only mark the absence of a ruler, but also stood as the clearest omen of the ominous uncertainty that settled over the city and the great storm that approached. Atreus and Thyestes, the exiled sons of Pelops, had taken refuge in these lands beside their relative Eurystheus, and they were no longer seen as mere guests, but as the strongest and most ambitious contenders for the vacant throne. Yet, the people and nobles of Mycenae, fully aware of the ancient curse that flowed through the veins of the House of Pelops and the endless ambition inherited from their grandfather Tantalus, chose to act with great caution in selecting their new king. As whispers drifted through the city streets and merged with the winds of the Argive plain, the hidden rivalry between the two brothers continued to grow quietly within the cold stone walls of Mycenae. The leading figures of the city decided to seek the will of the gods in order to determine the future of Mycenae and fill the dangerous void in the royal seat, and they sent a distinguished delegation to the sacred oracle. The answer that returned from the seer bound the fate of Mycenae once again to the blood of Pelops with unbreakable and ominous ties, for the divine sign clearly declared that the people must choose one of Pelops' sons to rule over them as king. This prophecy, ignited the spark that transformed the already tense rivalry between Atreus and Thyestes into an irreversible struggle for power. While both brothers sought to become the rightful heirs of the kingdom that had sheltered them, they also began carving their ancient hatred for one another into the history of Mycenae, not in gold, but in betrayal. The expectation created by the prophecy turned even the echoing footsteps in the palace corridors into quiet threats. Atreus, whose name meant fearless, carried himself with pride and harsh resolve, determined to embody that title in every step he took and every decision he made. After their father Pelops cursed them and exiled them for the murder of their half-brother Chrysippus, Atreus became determined to build a new honor and unshakable authority for himself in the lands of Mycenae. Seeking absolute legitimacy in the eyes of both the gods and the people, Atreus swore a great oath to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, promising that he would sacrifice the most flawless, magnificent, and unique creature from his herd to her. This vow was not merely a religious duty or a traditional offering, but a calculated act meant to draw divine favor to his side on the difficult path toward the throne of Mycenae. Yet this oath also became the greatest test of his pride and his greed. When fate chose to test Atreus's devotion with the same cursed arrogance that once defined his father Tantalus, a lamb unlike any other was born among his flocks, its fleece shining with pure gold. This golden lamb should have been brought to the altar as the highest and most sacred fulfillment of his oath to Artemis, yet the mesmerizing and radiant glow of its golden fleece awakened the suppressed greed within Atreus's heart. Instead of offering the miraculous creature to the goddess, he chose to keep it, believing it would serve as a symbol of his hidden power and his future kingship, and in doing so, he boldly broke his sacred oath. After quietly slaughtering the lamb, he carefully removed its golden fleece and locked it away in a hidden chest in the deepest and most secluded corner of the palace, where no one could see it, committing his first great mistake. This secret act reflected a dangerous continuation of the Tantalid tradition of deceiving the gods. As long as he possessed the golden fleece, the fearless Atreus began to nurture an unshakable yet deeply unsettling belief that the throne belonged to him by absolute right. Yet while he believed he held the key to his secret firmly in his own hands, he failed to see that the true key to the curse over his family rested in the betrayal hidden within the heart of his wife, Aerope. Though Aerope stood as his wife and the future queen of Mycenae, her passions had already drifted far from her husband's cold and ambitious nature. The young woman sought comfort from her husband's indifference and harshness in the arms of Thyestes, Atreus's own brother and greatest rival. This forbidden love grew in the shadows of the palace and became one of the gravest sins that darkened the future of Mycenae. Unlike his brother, Thyestes possessed a far more cunning, manipulative, and persuasive nature. He did not pursue power through brute force, but through betrayal and carefully woven webs of desire. His forbidden relationship with Aerope was not merely an act of passion, but the most effective weapon he possessed to destroy Atreus from within on the path to the throne of Mycenae. When he realized that Aerope knew of the divine secret hidden within Atreus's chest, he had no difficulty persuading her to steal the golden fleece. Seizing the opportunity during Atreus's absence from the palace, Aerope secretly opened the chest and stole the cursed and radiant treasure her husband had hidden from Artemis, delivering it with devoted loyalty into the hands of her lover Thyestes. With that act of betrayal, the sacred object no longer rested in Atreus's chest, but shone in the deceitful hands of Thyestes. From that moment forward, Thyestes stood ready to use the fruit of his brother's hidden sin against Artemis and his broken sacred oath to seize the throne of Mycenae entirely. Atreus, still blinded by the false confidence he drew from believing the golden fleece remained safely hidden in his possession, prepared to enter the great royal assembly where the fate of the throne would be decided. When the two brothers finally stood before the people and the gods of Mycenae, the atmosphere in the hall filled with the heavy presence of betrayal, deception, and the shadow of an approaching catastrophe. As Atreus stepped toward the throne with complete confidence in his divine right, he failed to understand the meaning behind the victorious and mocking smile that appeared on Thyestes' face. All present held their breath, waiting to see in whose hands the future of the kingdom would rise. At the historic gathering held before the nobles and citizens of Mycenae, Thyestes offered a cunning proposal, as if it were merely a casual suggestion. He declared aloud that the throne should belong only to the one who could present a divine sign in the form of a golden fleece. Atreus, completely certain that the fleece remained locked safely within his chest deep inside the palace, accepted his brother's proposal without hesitation, believing it guaranteed his victory. Blinded by his pride and by the betrayal of his wife, the fearless claimant failed to realize that he had just agreed to the terms of his own political downfall and the destruction of his honor. This moment became one of the bitterest examples in the history of the House of Tantalus, where deceit triumphed over truth. Just as Atreus prepared to retrieve the fleece with pride and confidence, Thyestes suddenly raised the golden fleece into the air before the stunned eyes of the nobles and the people. The brilliant golden light that filled the hall brought an expression of horror, shock, and irreversible devastation across Atreus's face. Though Thyestes did not openly declare that Aeropagus had helped him obtain it, Atreus saw the guilt and fear in his wife's eyes and understood the truth within seconds. As the golden fleece drew the wrath of Artemis upon Atreus once more, it granted Thyestes a deceptive yet divine appearance of legitimacy and elevated him as the new king of Mycenae. When Atreus realized he had been betrayed by those he trusted most, the fearlessness in his heart gave way to a cold and consuming desire for revenge. The people of Mycenae, believing that the prophecy and the divine sign favored Thyestes, welcomed him with great celebration and formally declared him their king, the son of Pelops. As Thyestes ascended the throne in triumph, Atreus lost both his crown and his honor, left betrayed and alone. Yet this victory did not grant Thyestes lasting security, for the growing fury within Atreus signaled that fate had not yet completed its design. While the palace walls echoed with celebration, Atreus stood in the shadows and silently swore that he would never forget the betrayal and the order his brother had created. The golden fleece became not only a symbol of power, but a sign that pushed the fate of the House of Pelops further down a darker path. This betrayal fractured the heart of Mycenae, and Thyestes stood at the center of that fracture. Though he held the power of the throne, he did not see or refused to see the consequences his victory would bring. For Atreus, however, the loss and humiliation ignited a transformation that could never be undone, reshaping his character and altering the course of his destiny. What began with the golden lamb became more than a struggle for a throne. It marked the beginning of a new era that would determine the future of the House of Pelops. Unease spread quietly through the streets of Mycenae, carrying the silent warning of what was yet to come. The crown upon Thyestes' head shone not only as a symbol of victory, but also as a sign of a fate that remained unfinished. As Atreus was cast into exile, the growing resolve within him laid the foundation for the steps he would take in the future. Aerope did not yet understand the full consequences of the choice she made. This new era for the House of Pelops became not only a shift in power, but proof that the ancient curse continued to endure. As the setting sun cast its fading light over Mycenae, illuminating the silence that followed these events, the cycle of fate continued, still incomplete. Within the massive stone walls of Mycenae, Thyestes sat upon the royal throne with immense pride, having secured a deceitful victory through the fleece of a golden lamb, while Atreus' heart burned with the searing fire of betrayal and humiliation. Atreus, who carried the full weight of his name, meaning fearless, in every step he took, stood within the deep emptiness left by his wife Aerope's secret alliance with his own brother and the theft of the sacred golden fleece he had held as holy, and he waited for divine justice to reveal itself. The cursed legacy of Pelops settled over the corridors of the Mycenaean palace like a heavier fog than ever before, and the people looked upon Thyestes, who had taken the throne through deception, with suspicion, yet they felt compelled to submit to the false legitimacy the golden fleece provided. As if atoning for the sins committed by his father Pelops and his grandfather Tantalus, Atreus never lost his faith in the gods, and each night he sincerely called upon Zeus, praying that the treacherous trap set against him would be undone. At the peaks of Olympus, Zeus watched the ambitions and betrayals of mortals with unwavering attention, and he decided he could no longer remain silent in the face of Atreus' rightful cause, choosing instead to act in order to restore the shaken justice of the divine order. Although the king of the gods recognized that Atreus had initially broken his promise to Artemis, he regarded Thyestes' forbidden union with his brother's wife and his theft of the throne as a far greater corruption. To deliver his will to the mortal world and prove Atreus' legitimate claim to the throne of Mycenae before all creation, Zeus secretly assigned his son Hermes, the messenger of the gods and master of cunning, to carry out the task. Hermes descended beside Atreus, gliding through the emptiness of the sky with the speed of light, and quietly whispered to him the famous offer that would challenge the limits of human reason and overturn the laws of nature themselves. Atreus initially experienced profound astonishment upon receiving this divine message through Hermes, but with the confidence carried in his noble blood, he rose once more and resolved to gather the nobles and people of Mycenae in the palace square. As the crowd assembled, they waited with intense curiosity to see how the fearless prince who had lost his throne could still dare to make any claim, while Thyestes sat upon the throne in arrogance, believing the golden fleece in his possession would protect him forever. Before the people, Atreus turned toward Thyestes and asked in a clear voice whether the kingdom would be returned to him if the sun's path in the sky suddenly changed and moved in the opposite direction from its usual course. To Thyestes, this proposal appeared more absurd than the impossible itself, for the sun rising from the west and setting in the east meant the complete destruction of the universe's most fundamental laws. Because Thyestes saw Atreus's proposal as either madness or a final act of desperate struggle, he accepted the claim without hesitation, wearing a mocking smile before the gathered people. Confident that the sun would set in its usual western direction, Thyestes felt satisfaction, believing that Atreus had now truly lost everything and would be forced to abandon Mycenae forever. The silence that settled over the square filled with an ominous tension born from the approaching miracle. The birds fell silent, and even the wind suddenly ceased as if it stood on the verge of changing its course. Atreus raised his hands toward the heavens and began to wait for the great sign Zeus had promised him. It was a singular moment in which the curse upon the house of Tantalus might finally be illuminated by an instant of divine justice. At that very moment, the chariot of the sun, guided by Helios, suddenly halted in the exact center of the sky, and under the horrified gaze of the people of Mycenae, it began to glide backward with impossible speed. This tremendous violation of the natural order painted the sky in a strange and terrifying red, and the sun moved toward the eastern horizon instead of the west, disappearing from sight there. This miracle in the heavens became the most undeniable and overwhelming proof in history that Atreus was not merely a king, but a ruler chosen and protected by the gods themselves. The nobles of Mycenae fell to the ground in fear before this display of divine power, while the arrogance on Thyestes' face faded, replaced by a deathly pallor and the crushing despair of watching everything he had gained through deceit vanish in an instant. This unprecedented intervention by Zeus did more than end a struggle for the throne. It openly exposed the dark and sinful alliance between Aeropagus and Thyestes before the entire cosmos. The reversal of the sun's path shone in the sky like an unbreakable seal, a symbol of the gods' fury against theft and betrayal, and it made Atreus's legitimacy unquestionable. Atreus now united the divine radiance reflected from his ivory shoulder with the crown of Mycenae that would shine upon his head, and he experienced the immense pride of regaining both the loyalty of his people and the favor of the gods. This event revealed how fragile the bonds of brotherhood within the House of Pelops truly were, and it proved to all of Greece that justice sometimes arrived with a force powerful enough to shake the heavens themselves. After the miracle, Atreus took the royal scepter in his hand and was proclaimed the sole and absolute ruler of Mycenae, and the people did not hesitate to renew their loyalty in the face of this unmistakable expression of divine will. As Thyestes watched the golden victory he had believed secure slip from his grasp, like a grain of sand, he soon realized that the throne he had seized through deceit would now bring him only death and exile. Having proven his rightful claim through this overwhelming sign, Atreus immediately began to exact the price of betrayal by banishing his brother Thyestes from the lands of Mycenae forever. This transfer of power became one of the most dramatic moments in Mycenaean history, and it was recorded as only a single curtain before the far greater disasters to come, disasters so terrible that even the sun itself had turned away in revulsion. As Thyestes left through the massive gates of Mycenae without looking back, the hatred growing in his heart toward Atreus slowly transformed into a deeper and more enduring desire for revenge. This feeling marked the beginning of a chain of events that would shape not only his own fate, but the future of his entire bloodline. Atreus reclaimed the Golden Fleece and secured his throne once more by punishing both his brother and his wife Aeropagus who had betrayed him. The peace he felt at first came from the relief of knowing the kingdom belonged to him again, but as time passed, he began to grasp the true weight of that betrayal more deeply. The extraordinary sign in the sky came to an end, and the sun returned to its familiar course. Yet the anger and resolve growing within Atreus remained, continuing to exist as a silent herald of a reckoning that had not yet been completed. Atreus's rule was re-established with the support of the gods, and his authority in Mycenae grew stronger. The will of Zeus and the sign Helios had given in the heavens confirmed his right to the throne at a divine level. Yet this victory did not fully erase the unrest within Atreus's soul. As he sat upon his throne, he continued not only to govern his kingdom, but also to reflect upon the betrayal that had left its mark upon him. From the outside, this new era appeared to be one of stability and strength, but in truth, it represented the beginning of another fracture in the fate of the House of Pelops. This victory, achieved through Hermes' guidance and the support of the gods, became only one stage in a cycle of destiny that had not yet reached its end. Although Atreus wished to believe his triumph would last forever, he remained unaware that fate would one day demand a heavy price from him. Atreus's ascension as king of Mycenae appeared to restore justice on the surface, yet this victory also revealed that destiny itself had not yet reached its conclusion. As Atreus sat upon his throne and watched the sun sink beyond the horizon, the shadows of the past and the uncertainty of the future remained beside him in silence. The evening that settled over Mycenae marked not only the end of a single day, but also the beginning of a new chapter in the fate of the House of Pelops. Seated upon the throne of Mycenae, Atreus enjoyed the absolute power that had been sealed as surely as the sun's passage from east to west. Yet in his heart, he carried a hatred colder and deeper than the chill of his ivory shoulder. True to the meaning of his name, Fearless, this king had planned down to the smallest detail the revenge he would take on his brother Thyestes, who had stolen his kingdom through deceit, and on his wife Aeropagus, who had betrayed him by handing over the golden lamb. For Atreus, a simple exile would never have been enough. As the grandson of Tantalus, the dark legacy that flowed through his veins, the inherited tradition of a cursed table and divine arrogance, demanded a brutality that would spiritually annihilate his brother. Every footstep that echoed through the massive stone halls of the palace seemed to transform within Atreus's mind into the clatter of plates at the dark feast he was preparing and the tragic end that would follow. Like his grandfather Tantalus, his gaze shone with a resolve that tested the divine and stood ready to violate the laws of humanity. King Atreus concealed with masterful skill the deep wound caused by his brother's adultery with his wife Aeropagus and the theft of the royal throne behind a mask of false courtesy. With solemn dignity, he announced to his advisors and to the people of Mycenae that shedding a brother's blood would only deepen the curse upon their house, and that for this reason he wished to establish eternal peace with Thyestes. This false reconciliation plan stood as the darkest and most insidious product of Atreus' genius, for he intended not merely to punish Thyestes physically, but to turn him into a monster against his own existence and his own children. As if sensing the scent of the approaching horror, the sacred hearths of the Mycenaean palace burned dimly, while Atreus sent a letter to his exiled brother that appeared sincere and carried the fragrance of peace. Living in exile amid poverty, misery, and the constant fear that his life might be taken at any moment, Thyestes had been seized by both great hope and deep suspicion when he received this sudden and unexpected news of forgiveness from his brother Atreus. In his letter, Atreus promised that he was prepared to share the kingdom fairly, and that the throne of Mycenae offered space wide enough for two brothers. At first, Thyestes could not comprehend how Atreus could soften so quickly after the great sin he had committed with Aeropagus and the theft of the sacred golden lamb. Yet his longing to return to the splendor of Mycenae paralyzed all his defenses. Taking with him his 3 innocent sons, Aglaos, Calileon, and Oenomaus, he set out on a sorrowful journey toward the Lion Gate of Mycenae, toward the lands his father Pelops had once cursed. At the entrance of Mycenae, Atreus welcomed his brother Thyestes with an exaggerated display of affection, as though he had waited years for this moment of reunion. The embrace of the two brothers before the people appeared, to those watching from the outside, as a hopeful sign that the curse upon their house had finally ended. Yet within Atreus's inner world, a very different determination ruled. He approached his brother's young sons, his own nephews, with a closeness that resembled a father's tenderness to an outside observer. But deep within his mind, a far darker plan had already taken shape. Thyestes, overwhelmed by this unexpected warmth, suppressed all his suspicions, and as he passed through the gates of the Mycenaean palace, moved forward unaware of the fate that had been prepared for him and his children. Preparations for the feast proceeded in great secrecy, and the smoke rising from the palace kitchens spread across the skies of Mycenae like a heavy veil. Yet this preparation carried a meaning far different from an ordinary royal banquet. Atreus personally oversaw the feast he declared to be in honor of his brother, planning every detail with care. It became not merely a banquet, but an echo of the dark events that had once stained the past of the House of Tantalus. In those moments when the silence of the gods seemed to reign, the wheel of fate began once more to turn within the same bloodline. The palace walls continued to bear in silence the weight of a truth not yet revealed. The terrible plan carried out at Atreus's command reached a point from which there could be no return. Thyestes' sons were removed from the life of the palace and placed at the very center of Atreus's design. As he prepared the final stage of his plan, Atreus deliberately preserved certain evidence for the moment when he would reveal the truth. While music and celebration filled the palace, one of fate's darkest faces continued to take shape behind the cheerful atmosphere. Atreus's purpose extended beyond protecting his throne. He sought to force upon his brother an unforgettable and shattering reckoning. This moment became an irreversible turning point in the destiny of the House of Pelops, and the ominous cycle in which betrayal and revenge intertwined showed itself once again. When the hour of the feast arrived, the great hall of the palace was illuminated by the trembling light of torches, and Thyestes, as the guest of honor, was seated with great respect beside his brother Atreus. With elaborate courtesy, Atreus filled his brother's plate generously with the ominous dish and offered the finest Mycenaean wines from his cellar. After years of exile and deprivation, Thyestes accepted the meal placed before him with peace. Yet the truth he did not know was that this table was not a symbol of reconciliation, but the stage of fate's darkest reckoning. The laughter and music that filled the hall echoed between the palace walls like a fragile curtain concealing the approaching tragedy. As Thyestes finished his meal and took one final sip of wine, the cold and rigid smile that appeared upon Atreus's face signaled the approaching truth. When Atreus asked his brother how he had enjoyed the meal, his voice carried a false calm. Thyestes thanked him with satisfaction, believing this feast marked the beginning of true peace. At that, Atreus summoned the servants with a single gesture. They brought a large silver platter covered with a cloth and placed it at the center of the table. The sounds within the hall ceased. Nothing remained but the crackling of the torches. When Atreus lifted the covering, the reality behind the feast emerged in full clarity. What stood upon the platter revealed, beyond denial, the truth of what Thyestes had just consumed. It was not merely an explanation. It was the moment that shattered a father's destiny. When Atreus looked at his brother and declared that the meal he had been served a meal whose true nature was revealed only afterward, time itself seemed to halt. Thyestes' eyes fixed upon the void, and his mind froze as though refusing to accept the truth. In that instant, the voices of his children rose within his memory, and the stone walls of the palace seemed to carry the silent echo of those voices that would never return. The hall, which had been filled with joy only moments before, was now submerged in a silence that bore the heaviest truth of fate. Thyestes leapt back from the table and tried to vomit what he had eaten, his body convulsing as though it rejected the reality before him. The cry of agony that rose through the palace halls sounded not only like a father's scream, but like the echo of the curse itself. His shout rebounded from the stone walls and filled the entire palace, as if even the sun withdrew from witnessing such a truth. In the face of this devastation, Thyestes cursed Atreus and his lineage, crying out that one day the account of this feast would surely be settled. His voice echoed like an oath carved into the stones of Mycenae. Atreus remained motionless and watched his brother's destruction. No remorse or hesitation appeared upon his face. For him, this moment marked the completion of the reckoning of the past. He then drove Thyestes from the palace and from the kingdom forever. As Thyestes disappeared into the darkness, he left behind not only loss, but the beginning of a curse that would return. The stone walls of the palace became silent witnesses that would carry forever the cries and the curse that rose that night. From that moment on, the palace of Mycenae stood not only as the center of a kingdom, but as a living monument to the terrible fate that had been enacted there. One by one, the torches began to die out, and the hall sank into darkness. As Atreus sat alone upon his massive throne, the pale gleam of his ivory shoulder lingered in the darkness like an uncertain light. That light no longer signaled victory, but the mark of an irreversible destiny. For that night had sealed not only a revenge, but the fate of the House of Pelops forever. As Thyestes was crushed more deeply each day under the unbearable weight of his suffering, he clung to life through a single consuming thought: to erase Atreus and his entire bloodline from the face of the earth. Driven by this dark purpose, he decided to consult an oracle to pierce the veil of the future, and the answer he received added yet another page of shame to the already corrupted history of the House of Pelops. The oracle whispered that his revenge could only be fulfilled through a son born from his own blood, through his daughter Pelopeia. This grim prophecy painted a tragic world in which even justice could only be established through the greatest of sins. In his desperate resolve to end the curse, Thyestes was forced to stain his own lineage through a union that defied the laws of nature. At that time, Pelopeia lived in the land of Sicyon as a young priestess devoted to the gods, known for her purity. Unaware of the horrific feast that had befallen her father and the new links in the heavy chain of the family's curse, she lived peacefully under the quiet shadow of the temple. Yet Thyestes, determined to fulfill the oracle's dreadful command, reached Sicyon under the cover of night, hidden behind a secret identity. As the sources recounted, taking advantage of the chaos of a sacred ritual or the deep concealment offered by the darkness, Thyestes committed an unforgivable violation and left her with child. This unholy act cast an even darker shadow over the bloodline of Pelops. During this tragic act, which unfolded entirely in darkness, Pelopeia never knew the true identity of the stranger who approached her. But amid the chaos, she managed to steal the sword from her attacker's belt. She carefully kept that sword as a bloody piece of evidence that would reveal the truth years later. After this event, overwhelmed by shame and grief, Pelopeia returned to Mycenae without knowing that the child she carried was her own father's son. When the baby was born, she chose to abandon Aegisthus, the living mark of her trauma and sin, on a desolate mountainside, leaving him to fate and death. To Pelopeia, the child was nothing but a source of unbearable pain and unending shame. Yet fate, the silent guardian of the curse, never allowed Aegisthus to die alone on that barren mountain. A shepherd found the infant, and according to legend, the child survived by feeding on the milk of a goat. The shepherd took the mysterious, abandoned baby to the palace of Mycenae before King Atreus, the absolute ruler of that time. Atreus never learned that the helpless child brought before him was both the son and the grandson of his greatest enemy. As it was remembered, the king firmly believed that he had extinguished Thyestes' entire bloodline, yet now fate had placed his own executioner into his hands and offered him the chance to raise him within his own palace. King Atreus decided to adopt the child, gave him the name Aegisthus, and raised him alongside his own sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus. Aegisthus grew up within the splendor of the Mycenaean palace, under the love of the man he believed was his father, Atreus, while his mother Pelopeia also lived in the palace as queen. Atreus married Pelopeia, unaware that she was his own niece, and unknowingly completed the tragic cycle of incest. As Aegisthus grew older, Atreus personally trained him and shaped him into a loyal and capable warrior. Years later, when Atreus captured his brother Thyestes and cast him into the dark dungeons of Mycenae, he decided to make one final move to complete his revenge forever. The proud king sent Aegisthus, whom he had raised and trusted, into the dungeon and ordered him to show no mercy and take the life of the man chained there. As Aegisthus entered the damp darkness of the dungeon with the sword Atreus had given him, he did not know that the weary old man before him was his true father. But when Thyestes saw the sword in the young man's hand, he immediately recognized it as the weapon he had lost on that cursed night in Sicyon years before. In the suffocating gloom of the dungeon, that encounter became the moment when the truth emerged in its most naked and horrifying form. When Thyestes questioned the sword, and Aegisthus explained that his mother Pelopeia had kept it for many years, every piece fell into place. Thyestes revealed, in a voice heavy with truth, that he was both Aegisthus's father and grandfather, and that Pelopeia was both his mother and his sister. The revelation of these hidden identities and the horror of incest sent a violent shock through Aegisthus's mind. He realized that Atreus, the man he believed was his father, was in truth his uncle, and the sworn enemy of his blood, and that he himself had been born only as an instrument of revenge. In that moment of awakening, his false loyalty to Atreus transformed instantly into hatred. When Pelopeia was summoned to the dungeon and learned that the owner of the sword was her own father, and that the attacker from that cursed night had been Thyestes himself, she could not bear the weight of the truth. Overcome by the twisted horror of it all, the unfortunate woman drove her father's sword into her own chest and ended her life. As Pelopeia's blood stained the marble floors of the Mycenaean palace once more with the blood of the House of Tantalus, a path without return began for Aegisthus. Lifting the bloodied sword of his mother from the ground, the young man fixed his mind on the single command carried in the blood of Thyestes flowing through his veins, to bring about the end of Atreus. Aegisthus left the dungeon without hesitation and went directly to the seashore, where Atreus stood giving thanks to the gods. When Atreus saw the fresh blood on the sword in Aegisthus's hand, he smiled in relief, believing that his brother Thyestes had finally been killed. But that smile froze forever when Aegisthus brought about the death of Atreus. Aegisthus killed Atreus, the man who had raised him and believed him to be his son, in the name of avenging his father Thyestes and his brothers who had once been slaughtered and served at that terrible feast. This killing of an uncle became the most ironic link in the chain of murders within the House of Pelops, for Atreus fell by the hand he himself had raised. As Atreus's lifeless body lay abandoned on the shore, Aegisthus returned to the dungeon and freed his father Thyestes. Together, they returned to the palace of Mycenae and drove Atreus's sons Agamemnon and Menelaus into exile. After years of painful wandering and the loss of his children, Thyestes finally reclaimed the throne of Mycenae once more. This shift in power marked the end of Atreus's fearless rule, but it also showed that the curse had entered a new and more complex phase under Thyestes' bloodline. The people of Mycenae had escaped a cannibal king, only to find themselves ruled by a sovereign born of a forbidden union, and the shadow over the palace never lifted. With Atreus's death, the mighty king who had once ruled Mycenae with unbreakable will passed into the depths of the earth, leaving behind only silence, fear, and an unfinished fate. His great treasures and magnificent tomb rested beneath the soil of Mycenae. But the true inheritance he left behind was not gold or stone, but the burden of a reckoning that would echo across generations. For his sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus, his death marked not only the loss of a father, but also the beginning of their exile. Forced to flee for their lives, the two brothers left Mycenae and sought refuge in foreign lands, where they learned to survive under the uncertain hand of fate. Their exile was not a sign of weakness, but a long preparation shaped by destiny for the day they would return. Meanwhile, Aegisthus remained in Mycenae, and after his deed, he stood at the center not only of a change in power, but of his own destiny. He had been born as the son of Thyestes and had carried the curse from the moment of his birth. The death of Atreus marked not only the fulfillment of revenge, but also the beginning of his rise to power. Yet his fate did not end with this victory. In the years that followed, his path crossed with a woman who would forever change the future of Mycenae, Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra was the wife of Agamemnon, son of Atreus, and the queen of Mycenae. Known for her iron will, sharp intellect, and unforgotten grief, she was not merely the wife of a king, but a figure with the strength to shape her own destiny. The anger and loss she carried in her heart would one day form the foundation of decisions that would again stain the palace walls with blood. The union of Aegisthus and Clytemnestra marked not merely the coming together of two individuals, but the rebirth of the curse in a new form. Thyestes now sat upon the throne of Mycenae, with Aegisthus standing beside him as the silent bearer of fate. Though the old king had finally reclaimed his throne after years of ruin, he felt deeply that this victory had brought him no peace. The stone walls of the palace still carried the echoes of the past, their presence lingering like an unseen shadow. As Thyestes and Aegisthus looked upon the destruction behind them, they knew it was not the end. The curse was a force that continued to move forward once it had begun. The sons of Atreus still lived, and those two heirs growing in exile would one day return to demand justice for their father's blood. This was not merely a possibility, it was the inevitable design of fate. The death of Atreus did not bring peace to Mycenae. It only changed the direction of revenge. The power that had once rested in Atreus's hands now belonged to Thyestes and Aegisthus, but this shift did not end the curse. Each day, the sun still rose over Mycenae. Yet those who lived within the palace felt that fate had not spoken its final word. The story of the House of Pelops belonged not only to the past, but also to the future that had yet to unfold. The fall of Atreus did not mark an ending, but the beginning of greater tragedies yet to come. And fate had not yet delivered its final judgment. The shores of Aulis had stood as a narrow and strategic harbor in the region of Boeotia in the ancient Greek world, directly across from the island of Euboea. This place had been known as one of the key gateways to the Aegean Sea, and it had served as a secure waiting point, especially for gathering large fleets and preparing for military campaigns. When the Greek kingdoms united against Troy, the entire fleet had assembled along this shore, and hundreds of ships had filled the narrow coastline of Aulis. Because of this, Aulis had entered history not merely as a harbor, but as a place where fate had shifted its course, and where the decisions of kings had been tested by the gods. The shores of Aulis had sunk into a heavy silence beneath the vast shadow of the Greek fleet of 1,000 ships. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, had stood at the head of the great campaign that was about to begin against Troy, bearing on his shoulders the weight of the title Fearless, which he had inherited from his father Atreus. The Achaean army gathered under his command had consisted of the most powerful warriors of the Greek world, and each of them had waited for the victory and glory that the coming war had promised. Yet at that very moment, the winds had suddenly ceased. The sea had grown still like a mirror that had lost all motion, and not a single wave had reached the shore. The sails of the ships had hung empty in the air, and the fleet had become unable to move forward. As the days passed, this stillness had begun to feel not merely like a delay, but like the warning of a disaster. Unease had spread among the thousands of soldiers trapped along the narrow coastline. Supplies had begun to run low, and the waiting had grown heavier with each passing moment. This massive force gathered for war had seemed as though it had been halted by an unseen will. Agamemnon had understood that this had not been an ordinary natural event. The past of his bloodline had been shaped by the intervention of the gods, and now fate had stood before him once again. The inheritance of the house of Tantalus that lived within him had whispered that this silence had been a test. The wind that had refused to blow at Aulis had halted not only the ships but Agamemnon's fate as well. The true cause behind these cursed and motionless winds had been the unrelenting wrath of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. As the sources had clearly stated, Agamemnon had fallen into great arrogance after striking down a deer during a hunt, and had declared, "Not even Artemis could have struck better than I." With those words he had wounded the honor of the goddess. Yet the roots of this divine anger had reached far deeper, extending back to the time when his father Atreus had hidden the famous golden lamb he had once promised to sacrifice to Artemis. This endless tradition of deceiving the gods, carried on by the descendants of Tantalus, had now exacted its heaviest price by leaving the entire Greek fleet stranded beneath the scorching heat of Aulis. The silence of the goddess had marked not only the absence of wind, but also the complete destruction of trust in the honesty and loyalty of the House of Atreus. As the fleet's desperate and hopeless waiting had continued for weeks, the seer Calchas had revealed, in a trembling voice, the terrible prophecy that would determine the fate of the army and all its kings. Artemis had demanded one unforgivable condition for releasing the winds and allowing the ships to reach Troy. Agamemnon had to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, upon the sacred altar like a sacrificial lamb. This demand had stood as a new and horrifying manifestation of the dark law of blood for blood that had ruled the House of Atreus. To set an army in motion, the life of an innocent child had been required. Agamemnon had found himself trapped in the cruelest grip of fate, torn between the deep compassion he had felt as a father and the immense responsibility he had carried as supreme commander. In his mind, the horrific family memories had risen one by one. His grandfather Tantalus serving his own son Pelops at a feast, and his father Atreus feeding his brother Thyestes the flesh of his own sons. Now it had been his turn. The gods had demanded the most innocent part of his own bloodline as the price for his ambition to destroy Troy and his hunger for victory. As Calchas's prophecy had spread among the soldiers, the army, driven by honor and the promise of plunder, had begun to pressure their king and mutter demands for their safety. In the end, crushed beneath the weight of the inevitable, Agamemnon had bowed his neck beneath fate's harsh yoke and had decided to set in motion a dark plan to summon his own daughter to Aulis, to her death. The plan devised to bring Iphigenia from the safety of Mycenae's walls to the shores of Aulis had become one of the most painful deceptions in history, the wedding trap. In an official letter he had sent to his wife Clytemnestra, Agamemnon had coldly written the lie that their daughter would marry Achilles, the greatest hero of the army and a demigod. This lie had caused the young Iphigenia to prepare herself as a bride, when in truth she had been prepared as a sacrifice, and it had led her mother to approve the journey with great excitement. While Clytemnestra had rejoiced at the thought of her daughter entering such a glorious marriage, wedding preparations had begun with enthusiasm in the palace of Mycenae. Yet what had been prepared had not been a wedding, but a funeral. Young Iphigenia had arrived at the shores of Aulis in the freshest bloom of her youth and beauty. Filled with dreams of marrying the glorious Achilles her father's letter had promised. Instead, she had encountered the unsettling silence that had hung over the army, as the innocent princess had rushed forward with love to embrace her father, and pray for his glorious victory, she had struggled to understand the sorrowful and evasive look in Agamemnon's eyes. The vibrant and radiant princess of Mycenae had not yet imagined that the stone awaiting her had not been a bridal bed, but an altar where her life would be taken. The use of Achilles' name in this bloody plan had drawn not only Iphigenia's life, but also the honor of the great hero into this dark family tragedy. When the truth had emerged one by one upon the shores of Aulis, carried on the faint stirring of the air, Iphigenia's sorrowful cries had echoed across the still waters of the sea. The young girl had begged her father again and again, crying, "Have mercy on me, father!" Yet her pleas had gone unanswered in the face of the army's hunger for Troy and Artemis's unyielding demand. Unable to endure his daughter's final pleading gaze any longer, Agamemnon had covered his face with his cloak beneath the crushing weight of his guilt. Iphigenia's mouth had been tightly bound, like the bit placed in a horse's mouth, to prevent her from placing a curse upon her father's house and bloodline, and the innocent princess had been laid upon the cold altar stone. This moment had been etched into history as one of the most painful and tragic chapters in the tradition of sacrifice within the bloodline of Tantalus. As the sacrificial ritual had formally begun, the sacred knife in the priest's hand had gleamed beneath the sun, and soldiers and kings alike had held their breath as they watched the tragic scene unfold. This cursed legacy of sacrifice passed from Tantalus to Pelops, from Atreus to Agamemnon, had once again demanded its price through the most innocent member of the same bloodline. Some mythological sources had claimed that at the very moment the blade had descended, Artemis had sent a deer to take the girl's place and had carried Iphigenia away to Tauris. Yet Agamemnon and the rest of the army had remained completely unaware of this miracle. For them, the sacrifice had been completed, and the innocent princess's life had been given for the sake of the army. Immediately afterward, the harsh winds had begun to blow once more, scattering the heavy stillness that had gripped Aulis. As the wind had filled the sails with great force, the Greek fleet of 1,000 ships had finally begun its journey toward Troy, leaving behind a mother whose heart had burned with hatred and a child who had been sacrificed. When Clytemnestra had learned that her daughter had been sacrificed by her father's command instead of being married to Achilles, a terrible fire of vengeance had ignited within her, one that would not fade for 10 years. Rather than lifting the curse upon the House of Pelops, this sacrifice had planted the seeds of the deadly trap that would one day be prepared in the bath for Agamemnon when he returned to Mycenae. The price paid at Aulis had become the clearest sign that the alliance between Aegisthus and Clytemnestra would one day turn the palace of Mycenae into the stage of an irreversible reckoning. Iphigenia's tragic fate at Aulis had taken its place in mythology as an eternal reminder of the absolute power of the gods and the catastrophic consequences of human arrogance. Agamemnon had sacrificed his daughter to open the path for his army, but that same price would ultimately lead to the loss of his own life and kingdom at the hands of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. The ships that had departed from Aulis had sailed to destroy the walls of Troy, yet the spiritual walls of the palace of Mycenae had already begun to crumble beneath the blood the king himself had spilled. This sacrifice had later been remembered with sorrow by the elders in Aeschylus's tragedies, who had spoken of it as the newest link in the chain of great sin that had settled over the kingdom. The inevitable law of payment that had ruled the bloodline of Pelops had spared no one. not even an innocent girl, and had demanded the heaviest price from the next generation for Atreus's broken promise to Artemis. Iphigenia's silent and sorrowful presence upon the altar had become one of the most powerful symbols of the merciless conflict between pride and fate. As the sun had set over the shores of Aulis, it had witnessed the sacrifice of a princess's life for a greater purpose and had opened the path the Greek fleet had sought. Yet the memory of that sacrifice had remained forever in the shadow of their victory. As Agamemnon had sailed forward with the wind filling his sails, he had felt an unease disturb his heart, like the false sense of triumph his father Pelops had once felt after casting Myrtilus from the cliff. The fate of Iphigenia would one day be remembered again, and it would stand as the silent beginning of the chain of events that would lead, with relentless certainty, to the final reckoning in the trial of Orestes. For a full year, a watchman leaned on his elbows atop the battlements of the Mycenaean palace, waiting like a loyal sentinel and scanning the horizon with patient resolve for the sacred signal fire that would announce the fall of Troy. As was remembered, King Agamemnon of Mycenae had set sail 10 years earlier with his vast fleet of 1,000 ships after sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia on the shores of Aulis in order to win the winds. During that long and painful wait, the palace drifted far from the honorable days in which it had once been ruled. In the king's absence, a dark sorrow and an ominous silence took root within its halls. At last, when the great beacon tore through the night like a second sun, traveling from Mount Ida all the way to Mycenae, the watchman felt both the triumphant joy of victory and the heavy dread born from the treacherous schemes unfolding inside the royal house. That fire announced not only the end of a war, but also the rising of a new and darkest chapter in the ancient curse that hung over the house of Tantalus. For 10 years, Queen Clytemnestra waited for this moment, the return of her husband from the battlefields, with a cold patience fed by a hatred that had never faded from her heart. This hatred did not grow from ordinary betrayal. It rose from the indelible grief of a mother whose own daughter, Iphigenia, had been sacrificed by her father upon an altar for the sake of the winds. While Agamemnon chased glory and victory in distant lands, Clytemnestra forged a dark alliance in the palace shadows with Aegisthus, the son of her husband's greatest enemy. Aegisthus burned with the desire to avenge the unspeakable humiliation his father Thyestes had suffered at that horrific banquet, and he waited in ambush like an emissary of revenge rising from the ashes of the past. The shared fury growing in their hearts hardened into an irreversible plan of destruction aimed at both the throne of Mycenae and Agamemnon's life. These two wounded and furious souls bound themselves together in vengeance and swore dark oaths to turn Agamemnon's homecoming into a tragic trap that would mark Mycenae's undoing. Despite her husband's fearless name and celebrated victories, Clytemnestra had long since buried any love she once held for him and replaced it with the sly comfort she found in Aegisthus's arms. While false sacrifices were offered and celebrations prepared at the sacred hearths of the palace, the true sacrifice in the queen's mind was the victorious Agamemnon himself, who was about to enter the city as a conqueror. Betrayal spread through the palace like a heavy scent soaked into its stones, and Aegisthus sharpened his sword in secret, waiting for the perfect moment to settle the debt of his family's ancient tragedy. The winds that moved through the corridors whispered of an approaching storm and the fresh blood that would soon be spilled. When Agamemnon set foot on the soil of Mycenae as a hero who had reduced Troy to ashes and destroyed the magnificent city of Priam, his pride and arrogance rose as high as the sky. At his side he brought Cassandra, the sorrowful prophetess cursed by Apollo, dragging her with him as both war prize and doomed captive. Covered in the dust and exhaustion of war, the king proclaimed with pride to his people that he had destroyed Troy through the justice of Zeus and returned home with the help of the gods. Yet he moved forward completely unaware of the greater and more cunning justice waiting for him at the threshold of his own palace, blind to the web fate had already woven in his path. As the people of Argos greeted their king with celebration, the city's elders quietly whispered among themselves, fearing that so much spilled blood would one day demand payment from the gods. When Clytemnestra stepped out to the palace gates to welcome her husband, she wore a mask of loyalty so flawless that not a trace of her 10 years of hatred showed upon her face. As she greeted him with exaggerated and deceitful praise, she carefully paved the dark and irreversible road that would lead to his tragic end. With solemn dignity, she ordered magnificent purple and crimson tapestries, colors fit only for immortal gods, to be laid beneath his feet. This gesture formed a perfect trap of hubris, designed to inflame his pride and expose him to the jealousy of the gods. Though it was considered an act of arrogance for a mortal to walk upon such sacred colors and disturb the balance of the universe, Agamemnon surrendered to his pride, accepted the offer, and began stepping along the path that led toward his own destruction. The doomed princess Cassandra cried out that she saw the ghosts of old murders wandering beneath the roof of the Mycenaean palace, and began proclaiming the coming catastrophe in terror. She declared in a trembling voice that she saw the spirits of Thyestes' slaughtered children and the ancient legacy of cannibalism clinging to the palace walls, and she foretold that both she and Agamemnon would be murdered. Yet because of Apollo's dreadful curse, no one believed her burning and truthful prophecies. The elders of Argos dismissed her cries as the ravings of a grief-stricken foreigner. With final sorrow, Cassandra cast her prophet's staff to the ground and walked through the palace doors with steady steps, knowing that her own life would be extinguished upon the floor of that cursed house. As her screams echoed against the marble walls, the wheels of fate continued turning for Agamemnon with unstoppable force. When Agamemnon entered the palace by stepping upon the tapestries under his wife's cunning direction, he took a proud step toward his tragic end. Seeking to cleanse himself of the grime and weariness of war, he turned toward the bath, unaware that he would meet the curse of his ivory-shouldered grandfather Pelops and his cannibal father Atreus within those waters. The moment of rest, prepared with such careful courtesy by the queen, transformed into the final scene in which the ominous shadow hanging over the house of Tantalus would take physical form. As he believed he found comfort in the warmth of the water, he did not yet realize that the threads of the inescapable net prepared by fate had already tightened around his throat. The footsteps echoing through the silent corridors of the palace began recording not the march of a hero, but the final approach of a victim into eternal silence. In the bath, as Agamemnon rested defenseless, he faced Clytemnestra, holding the intricate and endless net in her hands, and by then it was too late. She cast the trap around him like a fishing net, binding him so tightly that he could not even move his arms, leaving him utterly helpless. In that moment she raised the sharp blade of justice over him, fueled by 10 years of hatred and by the vengeance of her sacrificed daughter Iphigenia. The king's agonized cries echoed through the marble halls of the palace, proving once more how heavy the price of victories gained through deceit could be. Without the slightest hesitation in her conscience, Clytemnestra resolved to settle the account left unfinished on the shores of Aulis 10 years earlier with her husband's life, and together with Aegisthus, she carried out that tragic end. When Agamemnon's life faded into the waters of the bath, Clytemnestra received the spilled blood almost as if it were a sacred rain of blessing. This act carved itself into history as one of the most modern and most savage links in the long chain of bloodshed that marked the House of Tantalus. When the palace doors opened, the queen stepped before the people holding the dark token of her deed and proudly defended her action as a rightful revenge for Iphigenia. In her eyes, Agamemnon had sealed his own fate 10 years earlier when he sacrificed the innocence of his child for the sake of the winds. While she saw herself as the hand that carried out justice, the people of Mycenae trembled at the thought of new disasters and the coming of the Erinyes that this great sin would surely invite. At that moment, Aegisthus entered the palace and proclaimed to the world that he had been the true architect of the plan and had avenged the humiliation his father Thyestes suffered at that dreadful feast. For Aegisthus, this act stood as a sacred victory that ended the rule of the House of Atreus and restored his family's honor. Declaring themselves the new rulers of Mycenae, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus crushed the weak protests of the people and elders through intimidation and seized full control of the throne. Yet this bloody act did not calm the curse hanging over the bloodline. Instead, it ignited a new spark in the eternal and unstoppable cycle that demanded blood for blood. As Agamemnon's lifeless body lay in disgrace, the sorrowful image of the altar at Aulis remained more vivid than ever in the queen's mind. The victorious conqueror of the Trojan War was silenced forever on the very first day he returned home, trapped in the treacherous net set by those closest to him. It stood as one of the heaviest prices paid for the improper deeds that had persisted since Tantalus. Agamemnon's tragic end transformed the Mycenaean palace from a place of refuge into a dark arena overshadowed by family betrayal and curse. While Clytemnestra and Aegisthus celebrated as the new masters of this grim theatre, they remained unaware that the indelible stain upon them would one day prepare their own downfall. The curse now stretched its claws toward the next generation, toward Orestes, who grew in exile with burning fury, destined to avenge his father. As night fell over Mycenae, the wind that echoed across the plains of Argos began whispering through every corner of the palace the approaching footsteps of that avenger who would one day return. The massive stones of the Mycenaean palace trembled with a silent hatred and an indescribable sorrow throughout the 10 long years that followed Agamemnon's murder, when he was trapped in a net and slaughtered in his own bath. As remembered, the proud conqueror of Troy was butchered like a sacrificial animal within his own home, and this murder dragged the bloody curse upon the House of Atreus into a deeper darkness than ever before. Agamemnon's son, Orestes, was still an innocent child unaware of the world when this great atrocity occurred, and his loyal allies and his sister Electra sent him away to distant lands to save him from the deadly grasp of his mother and Aegisthus. As the young prince grew up in foreign lands under the shadow of avenging his father and the ancient law of his family that demanded blood for blood, the Tantalid inheritance that flowed through his veins drew him closer with each passing day to an inevitable reckoning. When Orestes reached adulthood and stood at the peak of his physical strength and will, he decided to seek refuge at the sacred temple of Apollo in Delphi to find release from the weight of the cursed burden that suffocated his soul. There, Apollo, the messenger of the gods and the Lord of Light, delivered his most absolute command. Orestes had to reclaim the dark throne of Mycenae from the usurpers and punish his father's killers as they deserved. The god warned him that if he refused to avenge his father, his body would rot with merciless leprosy, he would suffer from wounds that devoured his flesh, and his soul would be driven to the brink of madness as invisible scorpions lashed him without mercy. This divine command was no longer an ordinary choice for the young man, but a sacred obligation that had to be fulfilled, for a son who failed to punish those who ended his father's life would remain cursed forever in the eyes of both gods and men. Shaken by Apollo's terrifying warning, Orestes secretly set foot on the land of Mycenae, accompanied by his loyal friend and cousin Pylades, strengthened by the experience of his years in exile. The city groaned under the cruel tyranny of Aegisthus, the murderer of Agamemnon, and his mother Clytemnestra, who had betrayed her own husband, and in every corner of the palace, the shadows of past sins wandered like dreadful ghosts. Upon arriving in Mycenae, Orestes first went to the abandoned and deliberately neglected grave of his father Agamemnon, where he placed a lock of his hair in deep sorrow as a sign of his loyalty. Standing at the grave, he prayed with deep reverence to Hermes, the god of the underworld, asking him to awaken his father's spirit and guide him on this sacred path of vengeance. This secret visit to the grave was not merely a simple mourning ritual, but the first official spark of the great fire of revenge that had burned for 10 years, and it became the setting for his historic reunion with his sister Electra. After their father's death, Electra was forced to live in the palace like a servant, and under the hatred of her mother Clytemnestra and the oppression of Aegisthus, she became a wounded woman whose heart burned with fury. Because of the ominous dreams that haunted her mother and her fear of the anger of the dead, Electra was sent to bring offerings to the grave, and while she prayed there, she noticed the familiar lock of hair left by her exiled brother. When she saw the striking resemblance between the hair and the footprints on the ground and her own, she realized in that very moment that her brother Orestes, whom she had waited for like a savior for so many years, had finally returned. This emotional and shattering reunion at the grave marked the beginning of the great and unbreakable alliance formed to break the curse upon the House of Atreus. Strengthened by his sister's support and relentless encouragement, Orestes, guided by Electra and the women who brought offerings, devised a plan of deception that mirrored the ambush once set for his father in the bath. As Electra spoke of the corruption within the palace and the cruelty of the tyrants, she skillfully fueled the rage that burned in Orestes' veins and whispered that he must fall upon his mother like a lion. The plan was carefully constructed. Orestes would enter the palace disguised as a foreign traveler and catch Aegisthus in a moment of complete vulnerability, delivering justice with his own hands. Presenting himself as an ordinary traveler from Phocis, Orestes knocked on the towering gates of the palace and gained entry by telling Clytemnestra that he brought news of the death of the young prince Orestes. Although Clytemnestra displayed a false show of grief outwardly, she secretly felt great relief at the disappearance of the only heir who could threaten her throne and her life. Yet within the palace, there was only one person who mourned sincerely: the old nurse Cylissa, who had raised Orestes in her arms when he was a child. The honest tears she shed stood in stark contrast to the queen's cold and calculated betrayal, and revealed once again the moral decay that had consumed the palace. At the most critical stage of the plan, Electra and the loyal nurse Cylissa managed to convince Aegisthus to come to the palace without guards and completely unarmed. Aegisthus entered with great arrogance and confidence, eager to celebrate the death of his enemy and reassure himself of the unshakable strength of his rule. But in the dark corridors of the palace, he did not find an innocent traveler. He faced Orestes, whose eyes burned with fury as he held his father's sharp sword. Aegisthus, who believed he had avenged his father Thyestes' humiliation by taking Agamemnon's life, now became another link in the bloody chain as he died by the blade of an Atreid. The final cry that echoed through the depths of the palace announced to Clytemnestra that the dreadful end she had feared for 10 years had finally begun. When she realized that her lover was dead, she tried to defend herself, but she froze when she saw her own son standing before her. Saving her last defense for that moment, Clytemnestra exposed her breast and reminded Orestes of the sacred days when she had nursed him, pleading for mercy and invoking a mother's sacred claim over her child. Faced with his mother's heartbreaking plea, Orestes hesitated for a moment and faltered, even as Apollo's command echoed in his mind. At that decisive moment, Pylades, who stood beside him like a silent shadow, reminded him firmly of Apollo's unyielding warning at Delphi. Pylades told him, "You must always choose the friendship of the gods over the hatred of men." And those words ended the terrible conflict between Orestes' conscience and the divine command. Obeying divine justice and the demand of his father's restless spirit, Orestes dragged Clytemnestra into the palace and ended her life beside Aegisthus. This tragic act carved itself into history as both the most inevitable and the most heartbreaking link in the ancient cycle of blood and vengeance that haunted the House of Atreus. As Orestes stood over the lifeless bodies of his mother and her accomplice like a victorious commander, he lifted the cursed net that had once imprisoned his father, trying to prove to the people the justice of his actions. But the taste of victory quickly turned to poison in his mouth, for the blood of his mother awakened the most terrifying beings on earth, the Erinyes. The young prince began to transform, not into a triumphant king, but into a desperate fugitive, shaken by the horror of the sacred blood he had spilled with his own hands. Standing before the palace gates, he cried out in terror, claiming that the snake-haired goddesses of vengeance, whose eyes dripped with blood, were attacking him, creatures only he could see. Thus the bloody reckoning he had undertaken to restore his father's honor drove Orestes to the edge of a dark madness that demanded the sacrifice of his own soul. While Electra and the people of Mycenae rejoiced in their freedom from tyranny, they watched with shock and sorrow as Orestes paid the terrible price of avenging his father. Though the drama of the House of Atreus reached its peak upon the blood-stained ground of Mycenae, the claws of the curse had already pulled the young prince into a new phase of torment that would follow him all the way to his trial in Athens. Burdened by the destruction he left behind and the weight of his mother's blood, Orestes walked forward with exhausted steps toward the place where the gods had prepared his final and greatest trial. On the marble floor of the palace of Mycenae, Orestes stood over the cloak that remained from his father, King Agamemnon, once the conqueror of Troy, and he found himself crushed beneath the heavy sense of victory that came from avenging his father. As was remembered, this young prince had carried out the terrible yet divine command sent by the god of light, Apollo, from Delphi, by killing his mother, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. Yet this act had not ended the curse that hung over the House of Atreus. Instead, it had delivered Orestes' soul into the hands of the most ancient and merciless terrors of the earth, the Furies. As he stood before his mother's lifeless body, his mind filled with a suffocating and tangled guilt, as inescapable as the net that had once trapped his father in the bath. That moment passed into history as one of the most tragic proofs of how victory itself had transformed into devastating spiritual ruin. As Orestes tried to prove to the people of Mycenae that his act of matricide had been justified, he suddenly noticed terrible shapes rising from the shadows of the palace, visible only to him. They appeared as Gorgon-like creatures, cloaked in black robes, their hair woven from living serpents and drops of bloody hatred falling from their eyes. When Orestes saw these hounds of his mother, the Furies, he felt the reins of his mind slip from his grasp, and he sensed himself being driven toward madness like a charioteer thrown violently from his course. While those around him celebrated the victory of Agamemnon's son, he fled from the gates of Mycenae, running toward endless exile in a desperate attempt to escape the reality of these horrors. His flight marked the beginning of an eternal pursuit, born from the darkest forces of conscience itself. These three goddesses stood as the daughters of night, and they were known as the absolute guardians of the oldest law in existence, the law of blood. To them, Orestes was not a heroic son who had avenged his father. He stood as a criminal who had violated the most sacred bond of his own blood, and who was condemned to carry the weight of that act for the rest of his life. Though they possessed no wings, the Furies followed him like shadows, surrounding every ground he stepped on and every breath he took with the invisible presence of their curse. Because of these unseen pursuers, whose presence he felt constantly behind him, Orestes became a fugitive who found no peace anywhere on earth and who was driven to the edge of losing his sanity. This state revealed clearly that the curse upon the house of Tantalus had transformed from a physical punishment into an unavoidable torment that lived deep within the soul. As Orestes sank deeper into mental collapse, he wandered from one city to another and from one temple to the next, while the presence of the Furies became an unending echo within his mind. That echo resembled neither the sound of an instrument nor the whisper of a human voice. It manifested as a reminder that grew within the darkest corners of conscience and slowly consumed a person's will. The goddesses continued to follow him with silent certainty, never abandoning their pursuit and never allowing the shadow of his act to leave him. The son of Agamemnon felt his mother's presence in every wind, and each night he faced the weight of the past that never returned. This spiritual torment deepened with every step he took, binding his entire being with invisible chains of conscience. As the young man endured the terror of this relentless pursuit, he suffered as though his body itself decayed from disease, and he understood that his only hope for salvation lay with the god who had urged him toward this act. Apollo had commanded him to take up the sword and reclaim the throne of Mycenae and restore justice, yet he had not fully revealed the devastation that would follow within his soul. Seeking purification from the guilt that burned within his heart and from the torment inflicted by the Furies, Orestes set out with his final strength toward Delphi, the center of the world, to seek refuge in the temple of Apollo. This journey stood not only as an escape, but also as a silent and sorrowful plea for the divine power that had created this tragedy to bring it to an end. When he reached Delphi, Orestes' exhausted body, marked by the hardships of travel, created a striking contrast against the sacred calm of the temple. Holding an olive branch and a staff wrapped in white wool, he collapsed before the sacred center stone known as the omphalos and the altar of Apollo. The Furies who entered the temple behind him fell immediately into a deep and heavy sleep under the divine power of Apollo as soon as they stepped onto the sacred ground. When the Pythian priestess entered the temple at dawn to begin the morning ritual, she recoiled in terror at the sight of these dark and frightening beings lying motionless upon the altar steps. This moment became remembered as one of the most shocking encounters ever witnessed within one of the most sacred places of the ancient world. As the priestess described what she saw with the words, "They were not women, yet they were not Gorgons," she felt a deep dread rise from the heavy and suffocating air within the temple. Even in sleep, these creatures radiated threat, and their presence cast a shadow over the peace of the sacred place. At the foot of the altar, Orestes trembled like a refugee who feared the fate that refused to release him. At that moment, the god Apollo appeared and gave Orestes his unshakable protection. He declared that he would never abandon the son of Agamemnon and that he would defend him to the end against these dark pursuers. The presence of the god briefly lifted the oppressive atmosphere of the temple and restored direction to the course of justice. Apollo told Orestes that these ancient and terrifying beings had come from the depths of Tartarus, and that both gods and mortals feared their power. Yet he also knew they would awaken and continue their pursuit across seas and continents. For that reason, he called upon his brother Hermes, the messenger god and protector of travelers, and commanded him to guide Orestes safely. Hermes received the order to lead the son of Agamemnon along secure paths to Athens, the city of the goddess Athena, because only a court of law could resolve such a grave matter. This decision marked the beginning of a new age, when law and order replaced the era of personal vengeance and private reckoning. At that very moment, the shadow of Clytemnestra rose from the depths of the underworld, and her sorrowful and furious voice echoed within Apollo's temple. The memory of the dead queen fell upon the sleeping Furies like a call, forcing them to remember their duty. This unseen presence expressed the weight of her death and the mark of betrayal she had suffered, reminding the goddesses that justice had not yet been fulfilled. Her voice echoed through the stone walls of the temple like an ancient summons, calling not only for a mother's loss, but for the restoration of a broken order. This unrelenting demand for justice penetrated the minds of the Furies and awakened them one by one from their deep sleep. The heavy air of the temple shifted, and their presence became real once again. Their awakening marked not only the continuation of the pursuit, but also the final and decisive stage of the ancient curse that had followed the House of Tantalus. In that moment, fate itself moved toward an unavoidable confrontation. The final judgment would not be decided by force, but in the court of the Areopagus in Athens, where gods and laws would deliver their verdict. Orestes fled the dark corridors of the Mycenaean palace and the shattering memories that had grown in his mind after the loss of his mother, Clytemnestra. With his sanity slipping beyond his control, he reached the sacred hill of the Acropolis in Athens. As had been remembered, this unfortunate prince had taken revenge for his father Agamemnon's death, caused by a trap set in the bath, by punishing his own mother under the direct command of the god Apollo. Yet this act did not calm the ancient family curse that had reached its darkest peak with his grandfather Atreus's betrayal against his brother Thyestes' children. Instead, it unleashed the snake-haired Erinyes, the goddesses of vengeance, who relentlessly pursued Orestes. When Orestes took refuge in the temple of Athena on the Acropolis and wrapped his arms around the goddess's ancient wooden statue, he deeply felt that he had reached the final destination of the endless exile carried in the blood of the House of Tantalus. The Erinyes, who never left Orestes for even a moment, tracked him like ancient hunters and reached the very threshold of the temple, shaking the sacred ground with their hateful presence. These terrifying daughters of night had been known as the most loyal guardians of the ancient law of justice, a law that had endured since Tantalus sacrificed his own son Pelops in an attempt to deceive the gods. To them, Orestes was not a son defending his father's honor, but a criminal who violated the most sacred bond on earth. As Orestes trembled within the temple's fragile silence, he realized with growing horror that the fateful moment when his grandfather Pelops, with his ivory shoulder, cast Myrtilus into the abyss, now pulled his own soul toward a dark and inescapable destiny. At that very moment, the goddess Athena returned from the banks of the Scamander after the Trojan War and noticed the great disturbance within her city. She descended from the sky with the speed of a war chariot. The goddess of wisdom and war stood in astonishment as she saw on one side an exhausted supplicant clinging desperately to her statue, and on the other, the snake-haired shadowy beings who resembled no mortal creature. When Athena demanded to know their identity, the Erinyes proudly declared their names and their eternal duty: to pursue the guilty without rest or mercy. Athena insisted that justice could not be founded on rage alone, but must stand upon reason and evidence, and she resolved to establish a form of judgment the world had never witnessed before. Seeing that personal vengeance and endless family blood feuds dragged the world toward endless destruction, Athena summoned 12 of Athens' most respected citizens to decide Orestes' fate. This assembly gathered on the harsh rock of the Areopagus, where Ares once fought against the Amazons, and there they established the first murder court in history. Presided over by Athena herself, this court existed to bring lawful closure to the cycle of violence that began with the arrogance of Tantalus and deepened through the dark betrayals of Atreus. Although Orestes claimed that the stain of his crime had been cleansed through Apollo's purification rituals at Delphi, true justice could only be determined by the final verdict of this mortal court. When the trial began, the hill of Areopagus fell into an unsettling silence. On one side stood the Erinyes as the accusers, and on the other stood Apollo, the god of light, as the witness for the defense. The Erinyes declared in the harshest terms that Orestes deliberately punished his own mother, that his act shattered the universal order, and that such a crime could never go unanswered. Apollo responded that Orestes acted under his direct command, a command given after the great betrayal that ended the life of Agamemnon, a king of unmatched honor. The god emphasized that Agamemnon's death, killed in his bath by a trap set by his own wife, could never be separated from the burden Orestes carried. During the defense, Apollo presented a radical argument for that time, one that elevated the sacred right of the father. He claimed that the true parent of a child was the father who provided the seed. As proof of this claim, he pointed to Athena herself, who had not been born from a mother, but had emerged directly from the mind of Zeus, the king of the gods. The Erinyes rejected this claim and insisted that violating the bond between mother and child remained the oldest and most unforgivable crime. Yet within the courtroom, the air itself reflected the birth of a new understanding of justice. Standing at the center of this historic conflict, Orestes prayed to the gods with desperate hope, longing for the shadow that had haunted his bloodline to finally fade. At the end of the trial, Athena commanded the 12 Athenian judges to rise and cast their votes according to their conscience. One by one, each judge placed his voting stone into one of 2 urns, one for conviction and one for acquittal, with solemn determination. The sound of the stones striking the urns echoed across the hill, like the cries of every tragedy endured by the House of Pelops, like the final scream of Myrtilus as he fell into the abyss. The Erinyes warned the judges that if Orestes walked free, they would curse the land of Athens itself. When the votes were counted, the entire court held its breath. The stones were equal, 6 for conviction and 6 for acquittal. This balance revealed how deeply human judgment struggled against the weight of divine curse and ancestral blood. In that decisive moment, Athena exercised her authority as presiding judge and declared before all that she cast her vote in favor of Orestes. Defending order and balance, Athena granted Orestes his freedom. With that verdict, the ancient chain of bloodshed, born from the curse of Tantalus and carried through generations, finally came to its lawful and final end. The judgment delivered upon the steep, unforgiving rocks of the Areopagus hill in Athens marked more than the end of a trial. It marked the moment when generations of accumulated suffering, fear, and a fate that had seemed unavoidable were finally brought to a halt. When Orestes was absolved by the decree of the goddess Athena, that judgment did not merely alter the destiny of a single prince, it reshaped the ancient relationship between humanity and fate itself. For the curse that had begun with the arrogance of Tantalus had deepened through the betrayal of Pelops, had darkened with the vengeance of Atreus, and had reached its peak with the death of Agamemnon, had ended not by the strike of a blade, but by the power of judgment. Until that moment, the fate of every descendant of Pelops had been dictated by the crimes of the past, and each generation had paid the price for a transgression committed before their time. Yet the decision given at the Areopagus became the first moment when the chains of the past broke apart. This was not only the liberation of Orestes, it became humanity's first true victory over its own destiny. In the wake of that judgment, the ancient beings who had relentlessly pursued Orestes and had surrounded his mind with fear and guilt, the Erinyes, hesitated for the first time. They stood as the embodiment of the oldest order in existence, believing that spilled blood could never go unanswered, and that every crime demanded its price. Their presence had preserved balance in the universe through fear alone. Yet Athena's wisdom revealed another path before them. She showed them that vengeance gave birth only to more suffering, while justice created order. For the first time, the Erinyes confronted a purpose beyond rage. They were not destroyed, nor were they chained or punished. Instead, they were transformed. From that day forward, they were no longer known as the Erinyes, but as the Eumenides, the kindly ones. Once, they had followed the guilty like living shadows. Now they stood as guardians of the city itself. They ceased to be blind agents of vengeance and became conscious keepers of balance and order. Their transformation reflected not only their own change, but the transformation of humanity as well. It proved how the world changed when wisdom took the place of fear. When Orestes departed Athens and traveled toward Mycenae, he carried not only the weight of the past upon his shoulders, but the responsibility of the future. The young man who had once risen to avenge his father's death now returned as more than a king. He stood as the living symbol of an ending and the beginning of a new age. When the massive stone walls of Mycenae rose before him, those walls no longer bore silent witness to betrayal and fear, but to the fragile restoration of order. When Orestes took his place upon the throne, the shadows of the past still lingered in memory, but they no longer dictated the future as an inescapable fate. Instead, they remained as lessons carved into time. The ivory shoulder preserved within the palace treasury ceased to exist as a mere reminder of an ancient crime and became a symbol of divine mercy and the power of justice. It stood as proof that humanity could fall into unimaginable darkness, yet still find its way back into the light. Far below in the depths of the underworld, Tantalus remained alone with his punishment. His suffering extended beyond physical deprivation. His true torment lay in the knowledge of what he had set into motion. His arrogance had shaped not only his own downfall, but the destruction that followed his bloodline across generations. Yet in the end, the pursuit of justice by one of his descendants brought that endless cycle to its conclusion. This truth revealed the greatest law of existence. No curse endured forever, and no darkness ruled without end. Justice in time always found its way. The acquittal of Orestes and the transformation of the Erinyes into the Eumenides marked more than the end of a family's suffering. It stood as a symbol of humanity's ability to transform the darkness within itself. True justice did not exist to destroy, but to restore balance. True strength did not lie in punishment, but in the creation of order. The story of the House of Pelops endured as one of the greatest lessons ever remembered, showing how arrogance led to ruin and how wisdom and justice made renewal possible. The generations that followed Orestes did not live beneath the shadow of inherited guilt. They shaped their own destinies through their own choices. When the sun rose once more over the lands of the Peloponnesus, its light no longer illuminated a curse, but the end of one, and the beginning of something new. The shadow of Tantalus withdrew at last into the depths of history. In its place remained something stronger and far more enduring, the light of human will, the authority of justice, and the freedom earned through wisdom. And so, the curse that had once shaken even the gods faded into silence, leaving behind only a lesson that could never be forgotten. For this story continued to whisper the oldest truth of humanity. Arrogance gave birth to destruction, Vengeance multiplied suffering, but justice, even against the darkest fate, brought an end at last. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero, love.